The orbital temple had been dead for longer than some stars, spinning through the void like a prayer no one remembered how to answer. Kael Morrow watched it tumble past his viewport and thought, not for the first time, that he really needed to find a healthier hobby than breaking into 11,000-year-old crime scenes. "This is a terrible idea," Murphy announced through the ship's speakers, because the AI had apparently decided that helpful commentary was part of its core programming. "Noted," Kael said, already climbing into his exosuit. The thing was older than his PhD and made alarming clicking sounds whenever he bent his knees, but it had kept him alive through 14 previous expeditions into places where the universe had clearly posted keep out signs in the form of hard vacuum and structural instability. "I'm serious this time. The radiation signature from that structure suggests active quantum decay. Do you know what happens when quantum-locked architecture fails while you're inside it?" "I become a very diffuse cloud of pedagogically minded particles. You become a cautionary tale that nobody learns from because there's no one left to tell it." Kael sealed his helmet and grinned at his reflection in the polished metal. "Put that on my tombstone." The airlock hissed open, and he kicked off toward the temple, his maneuvering jets leaving small puffs of vapor that looked embarrassingly like cartoon farts in the starlight. 3 years of training at the Proxima Institute for Archaeological Studies, and this was how he traveled, farting his way through space toward a building that probably wanted him dead. The temple's exterior was a mess of architectural styles that shouldn't have worked together but somehow did, in the way that the Lyraean Empire had specialized in making the impossible look inevitable. Crystalline spires jutted from metal frameworks that seemed to grow organically from the structure's core, and the whole thing was covered in glyphs that his suit's scanner was politely declining to translate, which usually meant they were either religious poetry or extremely creative profanity. With the Lyrians, it was often both. The entrance had been sealed with what his scanner identified as molecularly bonded regret, which was the kind of reading that made Kael wonder if his translation software had developed depression. He placed a careful breaching charge, careful being relative when you were essentially knocking on someone's door with explosives, and stepped back. The seal cracked with a sound like sighing, and the darkness inside seemed to lean forward, as if it had been waiting. "Temperature inside is holding at -40 Celsius, Murphy reported. "Atmosphere is breathable if you enjoy frostbite and potential exposure to 11 millennia of accumulated space mold. You really know how to sell an adventure." "That's literally the opposite of my job." Kael stepped through the breach, and his helmet lamp cut a cone of white through the black. The entry corridor was exactly wide enough to make him feel like the temple was trying to swallow him, which he appreciated as good dramatic architecture. The Lyrians had understood that spaces should evoke emotion, even if that emotion was mild existential terror. The walls were covered in more glyphs, these ones his scanner managed to partially translate: "Forgiveness beyond stars," and "The weight of," and "Children's names we cannot." The fragments painted a picture of a civilization that had been very concerned with remembering something it desperately wanted to forget, which was either profound or the result of a committee that couldn't agree on the temple's mission statement. He found the archive chamber after 20 minutes of wandering through corridors that seemed designed by someone who'd read an architecture textbook backward. It was smaller than he'd expected, barely larger than his studio apartment back on Kepler Station, with walls made of that compressed starlight material that made him think of frozen light, if light could be sad about it. The shelves held the detritus of devotion, prayer stones, offering bowls, what might have been a musical instrument or possibly a torture device. It was hard to tell with Lyrian religious artifacts. The memory crystals were hidden behind a panel that hadn't been hidden very well, as if whoever put them there had been hoping someone would eventually ignore the "do not open" instructions. They pulsed with a soft blue light that reminded Kael of bioluminescent algae, if algae could contain the complete sensory memories of dead aliens. There were 47 of them, each wrapped in cloth that his scanner insisted was woven from concentrated prohibition, which sounded like something you'd get arrested for at customs. Kael picked up the first crystal, and it was warm in his gloved hand, which should have been impossible given the temperature. The glyphs etched into its surface finally translated. Not for witness, or possibly, forbidden seeing, or maybe just seriously. Stop touching things that aren't yours, archaeologist. He took all 47, naturally. Academic integrity was important, but so was being the first person in 11,000 years to potentially unlock the mystery of the Lyraean collapse. Also, he'd come all this way, and returning empty-handed would mean admitting that Murphy had been right about this being a waste of time. Back on the Revenant's Hope asterisk, Kael spread the crystals across his workstation and felt like a kid on solstice morning. If that kid was pushing 40, and the presents were potentially hazardous alien memory technology. Murphy manifested its avatar on the nearest screen, an androgynous face that Kael had programmed to look vaguely disappointed at all times, which seemed appropriate for an AI stuck babysitting him through deep space. "Before you do something catastrophically stupid," Murphy said, "I should remind you that Lyraean memory crystals interface directly with neural tissue. Human neural tissue is, and I'm quoting from the literature here, hilariously incompatible with Lyraean cognitive architecture." Hilariously incompatible sounds like it has a humor component. I could use a laugh. The humor is that your brain might liquefy. That's not very funny. Depends on your perspective. Murphy's avatar somehow managed to look more disappointed. "I'm required to log my objection to this course of action." Objection logged. Kael was already fitting the interface crown over his head, adjusting the quantum resonators to align with his frontal lobe. The crown looked like a tiara designed by someone who'd only heard tiaras described in the dark, and it hummed against his skull in a way that suggested it was either calibrating or preparing to give him the galaxy's worst headache. "Ready when you are. I'm an AI. I'm always ready. You're the one about to experience an alien's memories without any of the proper safety protocols or institutional oversight." That's the spirit. Kael touched the first crystal to the crown's receptor node, and the universe turned inside out. He was falling through water that tasted like copper and starlight, in a city built from geometry that shouldn't exist in 3 dimensions, and someone was screaming. No, everyone was screaming, had always been screaming, would always be screaming, because some sounds echo outside of time. Her name was Lyriseth, and she was running through corridors that bent away from her footsteps, trying to reach the council chamber before the vote, before the decision that would unmake everything. And she knew she was already too late, had always been too late, would. Kael gasped and yanked the crystal away from the crown, his own consciousness slamming back into his body so hard he tasted blood. The lab spun around him, or maybe he was spinning. It was genuinely difficult to tell. On his screen, Murphy's avatar had acquired what might have been concern or possibly smugness, also difficult to tell. "That looked unpleasant," Murphy observed. It was. Kael wiped his nose and his hand came away red. It was 5 seconds maybe, felt like drowning in someone else's nightmare. "And you accessed 1 crystal. There are 46 more." Kael looked at the remaining crystals, each one pulsing softly, each one containing fragments of Lyriseth's life, her memories, her pain. The smart thing would be to stop, to hand these over to a proper research team with proper safety equipment and proper institutional ethics boards. "Get the medical scanner ready," he said, reaching for the second crystal. "This is going to take a while." Murphy sighed, which was impressive for an entity without lungs. "I'm updating your obituary now. Should I go with brilliant but reckless, or just profoundly stupid?" "Surprise me," Kael said, and touched the crystal to his crown and fell into someone else's history for the second time that day. Lyriseth appeared in his lab on the 14th day, materializing between the coffee maker and the mass spectrometer like she'd been there all along, and he'd simply failed to notice. Kael, who was in the middle of his third unsuccessful attempt to stop a nosebleed while simultaneously taking notes on crystal number 28, did what any rational xeno-archaeologist would do when confronted with the translucent ghost of an 11,000-year-old alien. He dropped his coffee mug. The mug shattered with a sound that seemed unnecessarily loud in the enclosed space, and Murphy's avatar flickered to life on the nearest screen wearing what Kael had come to recognize as its "I told you so" expression. "There's a Lyraean biosignature in the lab," Murphy announced, with the tone of someone who'd been waiting weeks to deliver bad news. "Yes, thank you, I can see that," Kael said, pressing a wad of tissue paper to his nose and trying to look like this was a normal occurrence in his professional life. "Hello." Lyriseth tilted her head, and the gesture was so perfectly human that it made her pointed ears seem even more alien by contrast. "You're still reading them." She spoke in Lyraean, which Kael's neural translator converted to something his brain could process, though it kept adding footnotes about nuances lost in translation, which was distracting. "I'm documenting them, technically. Reading them is more of a side effect of the documentation process." He realized he was still holding tissue paper to his nose and bleeding on his notes. "How are you here? More importantly, how are you anywhere? The last crystal I accessed was from your middle period, before the—" He stopped, because he'd learned enough about her life to know that finishing that sentence would be cruel. "Before everything ended, you mean?" She moved closer, and Kael noticed that her feet didn't quite touch the floor, which explained why he hadn't heard her arrive. The crystals contain more than just memories. They contain resonance, pattern. Enough of me that when you started pulling at those patterns, you pulled me along with them, or a version of me, an echo. She smiled, and it was the saddest expression Kael had ever seen on any face, living or dead or whatever she was. Think of it as a very committed haunting. That's not scientifically possible. Neither was our faster-than-light drive, until we built it. Neither was the extinction of our entire civilization, until we managed that too. She drifted past him toward the workstation where the remaining crystals sat in their carefully labeled containers. "You should stop. What's in the ones you haven't accessed yet? I buried those memories for a reason." Kael pulled the tissue away from his nose, saw that the bleeding had stopped, and decided that was probably the most normal thing that had happened in the last 5 minutes. If you didn't want anyone to find them, why make them at all? Why not just delete the memories, or whatever you people did with unwanted data? We couldn't delete memories. Not without specialized equipment that the government controlled very carefully, because a population that can erase its own trauma is a population that never learns from its mistakes. Lyriseth touched one of the crystals with a translucent finger, and it pulsed brighter for a moment. "I made these because I was drowning in what I knew, what I'd seen, what I'd failed to prevent. I thought if I could just externalize it, put it somewhere outside my own head, maybe I could finally sleep through the night." She looked at him, and her eyes were the color of deep water. "It didn't work, for the record. I still didn't sleep." "I'm sorry. I don't deserve sympathy." She pulled her hand back from the crystal. "Do you know what's in the final 15? Have you guessed yet?" Kael had guessed, actually, though he'd been trying not to think about it. "The genocide, the one your government committed, the one you tried to stop." "Tried and failed, yes, but that's not the worst of it." Lyriseth's form flickered like a hologram with a failing projector. "The worst is what I did after. What I chose when I realized I couldn't save them. That's what's in those crystals, and that's why I marked them forbidden. No one was meant to witness that. No one was meant to know what I—" She stopped, and for a moment she looked like she might cry if ghosts could cry. "You should delete them, destroy them. Go back to your life and forget you ever found them." "I can't do that." "Why not? You barely know me. I'm just data in crystals you found in a dead temple. I'm not your responsibility." Kael thought about the last 2 weeks, about falling into her memories every day, experiencing fragments of her life like trying to assemble a person from broken glass. He'd felt her frustration at councils that wouldn't listen, her joy in discovering a particularly elegant proof in historical causality theory, her absolute terror the day the invasion fleet launched. He'd tasted her coffee, which apparently the Lyrians made from something that wasn't coffee but translated as coffee anyway, and it had been too sweet. He'd heard her laugh at her own jokes when she presented research that everyone ignored. "You're not just data," he said. "You're a person who tried to do the right thing and failed, and then had to live with that failure. You're someone who spent your last years encoding your testimony into crystals and hiding them where you hoped no one would find them, but also where you hope someone would. You're complicated and contradictory, and you made terrible puns in your academic presentations." He gestured at the crystals. "And I'm not turning away from that. I'm not turning away from you." Lyriseth stared at him for a long moment. Murphy made a small sound that might have been its version of clearing its throat. "This is very touching," the AI said, "but I feel obligated to point out that Kael's brain is already showing signs of structural stress from the memory interfaces. Continuing will likely result in permanent cognitive damage." "See," Lyriseth said, "even your ship's computer thinks you should stop." "Murphy thinks I should stop everything. Last week it suggested I stop breathing because the oxygen recyclers needed a break." Kael sat down at his workstation, pulling up his notes on the crystals. "Here's what I know so far. Your people discovered another species. Younger, less advanced, developing on 3 planets in the Korath sector. Your government decided they were a potential threat. You argued against intervention. You lost the argument. They sent the fleet anyway." He looked up at her. "What I don't know is what happened next. What you did. What choice you made that you think is unforgivable. You'll hate me when you know. Maybe, but I'll know. And you won't be alone with it anymore." Lyriseth's form solidified slightly, and Kael wondered if that meant something about her emotional state or if it was just quantum fluctuation. "You're an idiot," she said, but there was something almost affectionate in her tone. "It's been mentioned." He reached for crystal number 29. "Are you going to stay, or do you disappear when I access these?" "I stay. Lucky me." She settled into a position that approximated sitting on the edge of his workstation, her translucent form cutting through the solid matter like it wasn't there. "I get to watch you experience my worst memories in real time. This is exactly how I wanted to spend eternity." "You could leave." "I could, I won't." She watched him position the crystal against the interface crown. "If you're going to witness my testimony, the least I can do is witness you witnessing it. Seems fair." That's a deeply unhealthy approach to mutual trauma processing. "Good thing we're both dead inside then." Kael laughed despite himself. And then the crystal connected, and the universe dissolved into someone else's memory of fire and screaming, and the specific way light reflects off a warship's hull when it's preparing to commit atrocity. He felt Lyriseth's younger self standing on an observation deck, watching the fleet depart, knowing exactly where it was going and what it would do when it arrived. He felt her hand tighten on the railing, felt the specific texture of the metal, tasted bile in a throat that wasn't his, and somewhere in the back of his mind, he was aware of his own body convulsing, blood running from his nose again, Murphy's voice saying something urgent about neural stress. Then the memory ended and he was back in his body, gasping, and the ghost of Lyriseth was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. 18 more to go, she said quietly. Kael wiped the blood from his face. 18 more to go, he agreed, and reached for the next crystal. By crystal 35, Kael had developed a system. Interface with the memory for no more than 8 minutes. Pull out when Murphy started making alarmed beeping sounds. Spend 15 minutes recovering while Lyriseth made increasingly dark observations about his life choices. Document everything before the details faded. Repeat until either enlightenment or brain damage, whichever came first. You missed breakfast again. Murphy announced as Kael stumbled toward the interface crown for what might have been the third or possibly seventh time that day. Time had become negotiable when you were regularly experiencing someone else's past. I had coffee. Coffee is breakfast. Coffee is a beverage. Breakfast is food that prevents humans from dying of malnutrition. I'll eat when I'm done. You said that yesterday and the day before. At this rate, you'll die of starvation before the neural degradation kills you, which would be embarrassing for everyone involved. Lyriseth, who'd taken to manifesting in the lab's observation corner, where she could watch Kael slowly destroy himself in the name of academic inquiry, made a sound that might have been laughter. Your ship has a point. You look terrible. Thank you both for the support, Kael said, fitting the crown over his head. His hands were shaking slightly, which Murphy would probably have opinions about if he mentioned it, so he didn't mention it. 35 out of 47. We're in the end game now. The end game is where everyone dies, Lyriseth said, in case you'd forgotten basic narrative structure. Encouraging. He picked up Crystal 35, which pulsed in his hand like a heartbeat. If hearts could contain someone's memory of testifying before a council that had already made up its mind. What's in this one? You're about to find out. That's rather the point of your systematic self-destruction project. She drifted closer, her translucent form passing through his workstation without resistance. This one is from 3 days after the fleet departed. I was still trying to stop it, still believed I could make them understand what they were about to do. Kael positioned the crystal against the crown's receptor. Spoiler alert, they didn't understand. No, but watching me try is its own special kind of painful, so you have that to look forward to. She settled into what had become her usual observation position, cross-legged in midair, which would have been impressive if she'd been subject to gravity. I developed a drinking problem around this point in my life, just so you're prepared for the sensory experience. Fantastic. Kael activated the interface, and the lab dissolved into a memory of standing in chambers that were too bright, addressing counselors who were very carefully not making eye contact, and the specific way that hope feels when it's dying in real time. He was Lyriseth, arguing that genocide wasn't strategic policy, it was moral catastrophe dressed in military vocabulary. He could feel her exhaustion, the weight of nights she hadn't slept, the way her voice was starting to crack because she'd been making this same argument for weeks and no one was listening. One of the counselors, an older male whose name translated as something like profound wisdom, which was clearly aspirational, interrupted her mid-sentence to ask if she'd considered that her emotional investment in the issue was perhaps clouding her judgment. Kael felt Lyriseth's rage at that, felt her bite down on the response she wanted to give, felt her force herself to stay calm and professional because losing her temper would give them an excuse to dismiss her entirely. He felt her present evidence, statistical models, historical parallels to other civilizations that had chosen genocide and been destroyed by it. He felt the council thank her for her input and tell her they'd take her concerns under advisement, which they both knew meant they'd do absolutely nothing. Then the memory shifted, and he was in her quarters, alone, drinking something that tasted like regret distilled into liquid form, and she was crying in a way that suggested she'd forgotten how to stop. The interface cut out, and Kael was back in his body, shaking. The nosebleed was worse this time, blood dripping onto his shirt in a pattern that looked unfortunately like modern art. Murphy was making sounds that indicated medical intervention might be necessary soon, and Lyriseth was watching him with an expression that might have been concern or possibly just resignation. "That was 7 minutes," she said quietly. "You're getting faster. Lucky me." Kael's voice came out rougher than intended. He pulled off the crown and pressed his sleeve to his nose, which was probably unsanitary, but he'd stopped caring about proper lab protocols somewhere around Crystal 20. "The counselor who interrupted you, profound wisdom, what happened to him?" "He voted for the invasion, retired with honors, died peacefully in his sleep 20 years later, having never once reconsidered his decision. Lyriseth's form flickered. The universe isn't fair about who gets punished for their choices. No kidding. Kael stood up too fast and had to grab the workstation for balance. The lab spun pleasantly around him, which was concerning, but he'd deal with it later. I need to walk, clear my head before the next one. You're going to do another one today. Murphy's avatar appeared on multiple screens simultaneously, which it only did when it was particularly alarmed. Kael, your neural activity is showing patterns consistent with early-stage dissociative disorder. You need rest, not more alien memory integration. Noted and ignored. Kael headed for the door, then paused. Lyriseth, are you coming? The ghost looked surprised, which was an interesting expression on a translucent face. You want me to follow you around your ship? I want company that isn't an AI programmed to criticize my life choices. No offense, Murphy. Some taken, Murphy replied. Lyriseth unfolded herself from her mid-air sitting position and drifted after him. I'm literally a manifestation of your own deteriorating mental state. I'm not sure I count as better company than Murphy. You're funnier, though. That's a low bar. They ended up in the observation deck, which Kael had been avoiding because it felt too much like the spaces in Lyriseth's memories where terrible decisions got made. The asterisk Revenant's Hope was still parked near the orbital temple, and through the viewport he could see it tumbling slowly against the backdrop of dead stars, a monument to a civilization that had erased itself. Do you ever regret it? Kael asked, making the crystals, leaving your testimony somewhere it might be found. Lyriseth was silent for a long moment, her translucent form reflected in the viewport like a double exposure. Every moment of my existence, such as it is, but also no. I spent my life trying to make people see the truth and they wouldn't look. You're looking. That has to count for something. Even if it's destroying me in the process. I never asked you to do this. No, you just left 47 memory crystals hidden in a temple marked, "Do not open," and hoped no curious idiot would find them. Kael leaned against the viewport, watching the temple spin. We're both complicit in this terrible decision, is what I'm saying. Fair enough. Lyriseth moved to stand beside him, her form casting no reflection in the glass. For what it's worth, I am sorry. About the nosebleeds and the neural degradation, and the general trajectory of your life, since you found my testimony. Don't be, I chose this. He turned to look at her properly. The next 12 crystals. Those are the ones you really don't want me to see, aren't they? The ones marked Forbidden Witness. Yes. What's in them? What I did after I realized I couldn't stop the invasion. What I chose when I understood that my people were going to commit genocide and there was nothing I could do to prevent it. Her voice was barely audible. What I became when I accepted complicity. You weren't complicit. You tried to stop it. Trying and failing is still failing, and what I did after. She turned away from him. You'll hate me when you know you should hate me. I hate me. Kael thought about that for a moment, about the weight of carrying testimony that condemned yourself, about spending 11,000 years as an echo replaying your own worst moments. I'm not going to hate you. You don't know that. No, but I'm provisionally optimistic. He pushed off from the viewport. Come on, let's get this over with. I want to access at least 2 more crystals before Murphy stages an intervention. That's not reassuring. Nothing about this situation is reassuring. We're way past reassuring. He headed for the door, then looked back at her. You coming? Lyriseth hesitated, then followed. You really are an idiot. Yeah, Kael agreed. But I'm your idiot, apparently. At least until the neural damage becomes permanent. Also not reassuring. I'm on a roll. Back in the lab, Murphy had prepared what it called a medical intervention station, which consisted of several automated syringes loaded with neural stabilizers, and one sternly worded message on the screen about responsible archaeological practices. Kael ignored all of it and reached for Crystal 36. Last chance to walk away, Lyriseth said, settling into her observation position. Not interested. Kael fitted the crown over his head. Besides, we're committed now. Might as well see how the story ends. It ends badly. Most good stories do. He activated the interface and fell into her memory of the day after the council's final vote, when she'd made a choice that would define the rest of her life, and the universe dissolved into someone else's specific flavor of irredeemable failure. Crystal 43 made Kael throw up, which was a new development in his ongoing project of methodically destroying his central nervous system in the name of archaeology. He barely made it to the waste receptacle before his stomach staged a comprehensive rebellion against the concept of experiencing other people's memories of atrocity. I'm adding vomiting to the list of concerning symptoms, Murphy announced, with what sounded like grim satisfaction. Right below persistent nosebleeds and above talking to ghosts like it's normal. She is normal, Kael said, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. Relatively speaking. Lyriseth, who was currently occupying the space where his second chair used to be before he'd moved it to make room for more crying, made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. I'm a quantum echo of a dead alien scholar who failed to prevent genocide. There's nothing normal about me. You're normal for my life. Kael stumbled back to the workstation, his legs doing an unconvincing impression of structural stability. What was in that one? The memory cut out before I could process the end. Safety override, Murphy said. Your neural activity spiked to dangerous levels. I terminated the connection before you could experience permanent damage, though I use permanent loosely given that you've been accumulating damage for 3 weeks now. Lyriseth's translucent form shifted, became slightly more opaque, which Kael had learned meant she was experiencing strong emotion. That was the day I went to the detention facilities, where they were holding the refugees who'd escaped before the invasion. I thought maybe if I could document their testimony, get their stories on record, I could use it too. I don't know, prove something, change something. She looked at her hands, which weren't quite there. I was still operating under the delusion that evidence mattered. Kael's stomach twisted again, though whether from the memory or his body's general objection to his life choices was hard to say. How many refugees were there? 417, mostly children. Their parents had sent them away when they realized what was coming. Her voice went flat in the way it did when she was talking about things that had broken her. The council wanted them deported, sent back to their planets. I argued it would be a death sentence. They told me I was being dramatic. Were you dramatic? No, the fleet reached the Kareth sector 2 weeks later. The refugees' homeworld stopped transmitting 3 days after that. She turned to look at him, and her eyes were the color of deep water where things went to drown. I managed to get 43 of them hidden. Smuggled out through academic channels, claimed they were research assistants. The rest. She stopped, and Kael watched something crack in her expression. The rest were deported. I signed the transfer documents myself. Told myself I'd saved who I could. You did save them. 43 people who wouldn't have survived otherwise. And I sent 374 back to their deaths because I didn't try hard enough. Because I was afraid of losing my position, my access, my ability to keep fighting. I chose my own relevance over their lives. Lyriseth's form flickered violently. That's what's in these final crystals. Not the grand gesture of resistance you're probably expecting. Just a series of small, calculated cowardices that added up to complicity. Kael opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again because his head was spinning, and he was reasonably certain his brain was leaking out his nose. Murphy made a sound like a sigh, which was impressive for an entity without respiratory organs. You need medical attention, the AI said. Real medical attention, not the automated bandaging I've been providing while you systematically destroy yourself. I need to finish the crystals. You need to not die. Those things aren't mutually exclusive, probably. Kael tried to stand and discovered that his legs had gone on strike. He sat back down harder than intended. "How many are left?" "4," Lyriseth said quietly. "The last 4 they're the worst. The day the transmission stopped, the week after, the month after, and then the final one, which is—" She trailed off, and Kael had never seen anyone, living or dead, look quite so haunted. "Which is what?" "My confession. The thing I never told anyone, could never tell anyone, because saying it out loud would make it real." She moved closer to him, her translucent form passing through the workstation. "Kael, you should stop, please, I'm begging you. What's in that last crystal? No one should know that, not even you." "Especially me, you mean? Because I'm the one who's looking." "Yes." Kael thought about that while his head throbbed, and his stomach contemplated another rebellion. 3 weeks ago, he'd been a reasonably successful archaeolinguist with a healthy respect for proper research protocols, and a generally functional relationship with his own neurological system. Now he was having conversations with the ghost of a woman who'd been dead for 11 millennia, while his ship's AI filed increasingly urgent medical reports about his deteriorating condition. "I'm not stopping," he said. "Why not? You owe me nothing. You could file a report, hand the crystals over to a proper research team, go back to your life. Find a nice planet somewhere, meet someone who isn't a guilt-ridden ghost, have a normal existence that doesn't involve bleeding from your nose every 6 hours. "I could," Kael agreed, "but then you'd still be alone with it, and I told you I wasn't turning away. That was before you knew what I did. I know what you did. You tried to save everyone and managed to save 43 people. You made impossible choices in an impossible situation. You survived." He finally managed to get his legs working and stood up, swaying only slightly. "You want to know what I think the unforgivable thing is? I think it's that you survived when they didn't. I think you've spent 11,000 years punishing yourself for not dying with them." Lyriseth stared at him, and for a moment her form solidified almost completely, solid enough that she looked nearly alive. "You don't understand. Then show me. Let me see the last 4 crystals. Let me understand." "You'll hate me." "Maybe, but I'll understand. And you won't be alone with it anymore." He reached for crystal 44, his hand only shaking a little. "That has to count for something." Murphy's avatar appeared on every screen simultaneously, which it only did for maximum dramatic effect. "I'm formally logging my objection to this continued course of action. You're exhibiting symptoms of neural degradation, dissociative disorder, and what I can only describe as suicidal dedication to academic inquiry." Logged and noted. Kael fitted the crown over his head, ignoring the way his hands were shaking badly enough that it took 3 tries. "Lyriseth, are you staying?" "Where else would I go?" She settled into her observation position, translucent and miserable. "I'm tethered to these crystals, and to you now, apparently. We're stuck with each other until you finish reading my testimony or your brain gives up, whichever comes first." "Romantic. That's not the word I'd use." "No," Kael positioned the crystal against the interface crown. "What word would you use?" She thought about that for a moment. "Inevitable. This whole thing feels inevitable. You finding the crystals, reading them, refusing to walk away. Me manifesting, trying and failing to convince you to stop. Both of us moving toward whatever ending this has, like it was written 11,000 years ago." She looked at him, and her expression was complicated in ways he didn't have words for. "I used to believe in fate, before everything. I thought the universe had a plan, that things happen for reasons. Then my civilization committed genocide and I couldn't stop it, and I stopped believing in anything except the specific weight of failure. And now I'm a ghost watching a human destroy himself to read my testimony, and I still don't believe in fate, but I believe in this. In you being stubborn enough to see this through." She smiled, sad and genuine. "That's something, I suppose." "It's something," Kael agreed, and activated the interface. The memory hit him like a physical thing. Lyriseth standing in a communications center, watching the display screens go dark one by one as the transmissions from the Koreth sector stopped. knowing exactly what that silence meant. He felt her hands gripping the console edge, felt the specific texture of the metal, tasted copper in a mouth that wasn't his. Felt her scream building in a throat that had forgotten how to make sound, felt her knees give out, felt hands catching her before she hit the floor, felt everything and nothing all at once. Then he was back in his body, on his knees, blood pouring from his nose and possibly his ears, and Lyriseth was hovering over him looking more solid than he'd ever seen her, almost real enough to touch. 3 more, he said or tried to say. His voice came out as a rasp. You're dying, she said, and she sounded angry about it. Murphy's right, this is killing you. 3 more, he repeated, and reached for Crystal 45. Crystal 47 sat on the workstation between them like a confession neither of them was ready to hear. Kael had managed to get through 46, had experienced Lyriseth's memories of the month after the genocide, the year after, the decade after, each one a study in how someone learns to live with the weight of failure. He'd watched her testimony unfold in fragments of sensory data, the taste of grief, the specific way guilt felt in someone else's chest, the sound of silence where transmissions used to be. Now he was sitting on the floor of his lab, because chairs required more structural integrity than his spine currently possessed, and Lyriseth was hovering approximately 3 inches above the deck plating, more solid than she'd ever been. Murphy had stopped making alarmed comments about his vital signs somewhere around Crystal 45, which Kael suspected meant either the AI had given up on him, or was too busy filing emergency medical reports to bother with commentary. You look terrible, Lyriseth said, with what might have been affection. You keep saying that. Kael's voice came out rough. He'd stopped bothering to clean up the nosebleeds around Crystal 42, and his shirt was now an abstract art piece in various shades of red. It's not getting less true, but you keep saying it. I'm hoping repetition will eventually inspire you to make better life choices. Bold strategy from someone who encoded her trauma into 47 crystals and hid them in a temple. That's fair. She drifted closer, settling into a cross-legged position that would have been impressive if she'd been subject to gravity or physical laws generally. The last one. Are you ready? Absolutely not, are you? I've had 11,000 years to prepare for someone reading my confession. Turns out that's not enough time. She reached toward Crystal 47, but her hand passed through it, because ghosts couldn't actually touch things, which seemed like a design flaw in the universe. Do you want to know what it says before you access it? Kael thought about that. His head was pounding in a way that suggested his brain was trying to escape through his eye sockets, and Murphy had informed him that his neural patterns were now catastrophically divergent from baseline human norms, which sounded bad. No, I want to experience it the way you meant it to be experienced, as testimony. Even if it breaks you. I'm already broken. Have you seen my shirt? He gestured at the bloodstains. This is definitely not coming out in the wash. Lyriseth made a sound that might have been laughter or possibly crying. It was hard to tell with quantum echoes. You're the worst archaeologist I've ever met. I'm the only archaeologist you've met in 11,000 years. Still the worst. She watched him reach for the crystal, her expression complicated in ways he'd stopped trying to parse. Kael, after this, after you read the last one, I don't know what happens, to me, to this. She gestured at her translucent form. The crystals are the only thing tethering me to existence. When you've read them all, when there's no more testimony to witness. You think you'll disappear. I think I'll finally get to stop existing, yes, which should be a relief, except. She trailed off, and Kael realized with some surprise that she was scared. Except you've gotten used to having someone witness you. I've gotten used to you, specifically. Your terrible coffee and your worse self-preservation instincts, and the way you keep reading my memories even though it's literally killing you. She looked at him properly, and her eyes were impossibly deep. Thank you for not turning away, for seeing all of it and not hating me. I could never hate you. Kael picked up the final crystal, felt it pulse warm against his palm. You tried to save your civilization from itself. You failed, but you tried. That matters. Does it? All those people are still dead. I still signed those deportation orders. I still chose my career over their lives. You saved 43 children. You spent your final years encoding testimony that would make sure someone, eventually, knew what happened. You refused to let the genocide be forgotten. He fitted the interface crown over his head for the last time. That matters too. Kael, I know. Whatever's in here, whatever you think is unforgivable, I'm ready. He positioned the crystal against the receptor. Are you? Lyriseth was quiet for a long moment. No, but do it anyway. The interface activated, and Kael fell into her final memory. He was Lyriseth, 40 years after the genocide, standing in what had once been the Korath sector and was now just empty space where civilizations used to be. She'd spent 4 decades becoming the Empire's foremost expert on what they'd done, documenting it in excruciating detail, making sure every death was recorded, every name preserved. She'd written books that no one read, given lectures that auditoriums of empty chairs attended, refused to let anyone forget even though everyone wanted to. But here, in this moment, she was alone with the truth she'd never told anyone. She was glad she'd survived, glad she'd chosen her own life over joining them in death, glad she'd saved 43 instead of dying with 374. The guilt was enormous, crushing, a weight that would follow her until she finally stopped existing, but underneath it was a terrible, selfish relief that she'd lived. Kael felt her hatred of herself for that relief, felt her shame at the gladness, felt the specific way that surviving atrocity feels when you think you should have died with the victims. Felt her encode this confession into the crystal, this admission that she'd chosen life over martyrdom and couldn't forgive herself for it. The memory released him, and Kael was back in his body, crying, which was new. The tears mixed with the blood from his nose in a way that would have been poetic if it wasn't so messy. You survived, he said, looking at Lyriseth's translucent form. You hated yourself for surviving, but you survived anyway. And you spent the rest of your life making sure they weren't forgotten. That doesn't absolve me. No, but it matters. He pulled off the interface crown, his hands shaking. You think the unforgivable thing is that you were glad you lived. But Lyriseth, being glad you survived doesn't mean you didn't care about them. It means you're alive. That's not a sin. That's just being alive. She stared at him, and her form was flickering now, becoming less solid. I don't deserve forgiveness. Maybe not, but you deserve to be witnessed, to have someone know your story and not turn away from it. He stood up, which took more effort than it should have. I read all 47 crystals. I know what you did, what you tried to do, what you failed to do. I know your shame and your guilt and your terrible human relief at surviving. He moved closer to her fading form. And I'm still here. I'm still witnessing you. Why? Her voice was barely audible now. Why does it matter so much to you? Because you spent 11,000 years alone with your guilt, and no one should be alone with that. Kael reached toward her, and even though his hand passed through her translucent form, the gesture still meant something. Because you tried to make people see the truth, and they wouldn't look, but I'm looking now. Because your story matters, even if it's painful, especially because it's painful. Lyriseth's form solidified for just a moment, long enough that he could almost believe she was real. I'm going to disappear now, aren't I? Now that you've read all of them. Probably. I'm scared. I know. Will you remember me after I'm gone? Every day. Kael smiled through the blood and tears. I'm going to write about you, your testimony, what you tried to do. Make sure people know about Lyriseth, the scholar who tried to save her civilization and failed, but who made sure someone would eventually know the truth. That's a terrible legacy. It's an honest one. She laughed then, genuine and sad and beautiful, and her form began to fade like morning mist. Thank you, Kael Morrow, for reading what I never meant anyone to see, for not turning away. Thank you for leaving it to be found. Lyriseth smiled one last time, and then she was gone, dissolved into quantum probability and memory, leaving Kael alone in his lab with 47 empty crystals and a head full of someone else's testimony. Murphy's avatar appeared on the nearest screen. She's gone. Yeah, Kael sat down heavily, suddenly exhausted. How bad is the neural damage? Significant but not permanent. You'll need extensive therapy and probably some very uncomfortable conversations with medical professionals about your decision-making processes. Worth it. That's a matter of opinion. Murphy paused. Are you all right? Kael thought about that. He was covered in blood, possibly brain damaged, definitely traumatized from experiencing fragments of genocide through someone else's memories. But he'd witnessed Lyriseth's testimony. He'd seen her truth and not turned away. He'd given her what she'd needed 11,000 years ago, someone who would look. Yeah, he said. I'm all right. Get me a medical pod, Murphy, and then help me draft a paper. I have a story to tell. About a dead civilization and the scholar who tried to save it. About a woman who survived when she thought she shouldn't have and spent eternity punishing herself for it. Kael looked at the empty crystals. And about how being witnessed, really witnessed, can matter more than forgiveness. That's going to be a very strange paper. Good, Kael said, and finally let himself pass out.